All right, let's look at that final argument that's offered up by Rachels. This argument is also an argument that it is not morally permissible for Mr. Latimer to kill Tracy Latimer. And Rachels names this argument the slippery slope argument. Now, slippery slope is a name that's associated with what's called an informal fallacy, an argument that's considered to be a bad argument form generally. So we'll want to be careful about just naming this argument as a bad argument. We'll want to see why it is that we might name it this way, what its structure is, whether it really does count as an instance of this kind of argument. So the first premise of this argument says that if we allow killing in cases like Tracy's, then it will break the prohibition on killing. So we have this universal prohibition against killing, and this argument says if we allow Mr. Latimer to be morally permissible in killing Tracy, then we break that universal prohibition on killing. Next premise. If that prohibition gets broken, this argument then in the second premise predicts that it will get eroded again and again and again. This one exception will results in people coming up with other exceptions and other exceptions and other exceptions until instead of a universal prohibition against killing, we have a crippled, a highly caveated principle against killing that makes life pretty cheap, that allows people to kill one another in lots and lots of different circumstances. So it undermines the point of that universal prohibition against killing. And so it concludes that killing Tracy is wrong. It doesn't conclude that killing Tracy is wrong because of the intrinsic wrongness of that particular act. Instead, it concludes that killing Tracy is wrong because by allowing exceptions to our general prohibition against killing, the result will be that it will trigger a series of events that will undermine prohibitions against killing dramatically and thereby render them ineffectual. So what's Rachel's evaluation of that argument? Well, he thinks that it's possibly or plausibly an unsound argument. And the reason why is that he thinks it is an instance of one of these bad arguments, these informal fallacies. So he recognizes that the sanctity of human life is an important ethical principle, that this prohibition against killing people is an important principle. And he even goes on to say that he thinks it's a cornerstone of contemporary Western morality, of democracies where there's rule of law, and so on. And so he acknowledges that one can have serious concerns about the cheapening of life, about undermining this kind of prohibition or this kind of assertion that human life is sacred. However, he also thinks that the argument relies on highly speculative claims about the consequences of allowing even a well-circumscribed, highly principled set of exceptions that occur very rarely to this general principle. And so he thinks that this argument really is an instance of slippery slope. And slippery slope arguments have all the same structure. They start off with a premise that says, look, here's a first initial step, something that you don't think is necessarily bad. Now, here's a whole bunch of things that are going to follow from that, and they'll ultimately lead to this terrible, usually unanticipated consequence. Since this unanticipated consequence that will determinately result from that initial step is unacceptable, then the initial step itself is unacceptable. Now, slippery slope arguments are considered to be inductive arguments, and they're considered to be weak inductive arguments because they rely on this determinate chain of events unfolding just as predicted in the argument. And predicting how the world is going to unfold, especially in cases like how society will develop and so on, is extremely difficult. there are all sorts of different variables, all sorts of different ways things can fall out. And so as a result, those predictions tend to not be very likely to come true as anticipated. And so for that reason, people are justifiably wary of slippery slope arguments like this, because you need a lot of evidence to suppose that that chain is going to unfold exactly the way you think it will. So, for example, in the case of legalizing gay marriage, one of the arguments against legalizing gay marriage that was offered up early on was a slippery slope argument. So people argued, like, look, if you allow people with the same gender to marry, then the next thing you know, people will think it'll be okay for multiple people to marry, and so we'll have polygamy is legal. And once polygamy is legal, then what's to prevent us from having interspecies marriages? And then we'll have bestiality, and who knows, people may end up marrying trees, and so on and so forth. And this argument, in fact, was offered up by Bill O'Reilly on Fox News at one point. So these kinds of arguments make claims, and as we've seen, legalization of same-sex marriage hasn't resulted in the legalization of, I don't know, man and bug marriage, right? So how the world's going to unfold is difficult to predict, and arguments that rely on a very specific causal chain unfolding are arguments that we want to be wary of. And this is why Rachel thinks this argument is likely to be unsound. That second premise, he thinks, is probably false. So now Rachel wants to draw some morals from the consideration of the cases that we've looked at so far. And the first moral that he wants to draw is that moral judgments have to follow from reasons. And so he gives us a couple of bits of evidence in support of that moral. So one thing he notes is that our initial judgments in cases, especially complex and unusual cases like this, they often differ from each other. And in fact, we might find that we have strong emotional reactions to cases that, once we think about them, don't seem like the appropriate reaction. We might have intuitive judgments about cases, but we might then come to be persuaded by reasons. And so when people have different intuitions about cases, when they may have strong emotional reactions or strong intuitive judgments about cases, but the cases are complex and difficult and people disagree, he thinks the vehicle for trying to engage in meaningful and constructive moral debate has to be this vehicle of arguments, of giving reasons, of being rational, citing evidence, principles, and so on. And so he suggests that correct judgments in lots and lots of cases like this are discovered. They're not felt or intuitive. They are reasoned out. We look at all the evidence. We look at the nuances of the cases. We look at other people's perspectives. We look at how they think the evidence implies a particular judgment. And it's only through this process that we get to something that looks like it's the correct judgment about these cases. And of course, all of these cases are cases that are pretty complex. They are nuanced. They involve lots of moving parts. Different principles get cited in different arguments. The cases themselves involve different diseases with variable symptomologies and so on, right? And so when you have a complex case like this, it's very difficult to make a judgment, an intuitive judgment or a moral or emotional reaction to it that in any way sort of recognizes the complexity and the nuances of that case. Only through giving reasons, by evaluating the case carefully, by organizing ideas into arguments, Rachel suggests, do we really get a handle on complex cases like this. And finally, he wants to suggest that moral judgments are normative claims. That is, when we make a moral judgment, we're not just saying, well, this one time for this one person, this is what they ought to do. We want to make a moral judgment that is a general rule to guide people's action. Right? So if I say it's wrong for you to cheat on a test, right, And then you say, okay, that's fine. I won't cheat on this test. I'll cheat on the next test because this judgment is just about this case. That seems kind of odd. What we really say when it's wrong to cheat on the test is that, look, this is a general principle, a norm that should guide your actions, not just on this test, but on the next test and on the test after that. And how do we get normative claims? How do we make moral judgments that have this normative force to them, that are potential legitimate guides for action? And the answer that Rachel wants to give is that we get normative claims when our moral judgments achieve a certain amount of consensus, when they're seen as principled, when they're seen as rational, when they're seen as being developed with an eye to the concerns and values and interests of all the people who are being affected. And so he wants to argue that the way that you get consensus is through reasoning, is through argument, through constructive debate that's based on looking at evidence, principles, what people agree on, what people disagree on, and hashing these things out. That's how you achieve consensus. And he also thinks that an important component of being able to achieve consensus is that one sees these judgments, these norms, not only as being reasonable, right, but as being equitable, as being fair, as being impartial, in that they consider everybody's interest who gets affected by these actions equally. They're not biased, they're not arbitrary, they're not otherwise irrational. They are based on reasons, on principles, and one of the important principles that they're based on is that people's interests are treated equally, that everyone is considered, that they are not just dismissed or devalued. And so the big message that he gets from looking at these cases is that moral behavior requires reasoning, and it requires impartial consideration of everyone's interests. So I think we're going to have to do one more segment to talk about the minimum moral conception, and then we'll be done with this lecture.